A Fox News alert. A judge has released the results of a 1999 grand jury investigation into the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. And it shows that jurors voted to indict both parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, on felony counts, fatal child abuse and accessory to a crime. You may recall the parents were under a cloud of suspicion for a long time, but were never charged in the murder of their daughter. Let's look back now at the investigation. JonBenet found dead in the family's Colorado home on the day after Christmas in 1996. A strange ransom note was also found. Portions of the autopsy report later showed that she suffered serious head injuries and was sexually assaulted. Well, shortly after the investigation began, police turned their attention to the parents. Both John and Patricia Ramsey denied killing their daughter, but they were not cooperative with the police at the beginning. Both refused to submit to polygraph tests. But finally, after months of pressure, both did sit down and were separately questioned by police for the first time. And then in September 1998, a grand jury officially launched its investigation. It lasted 18 months, and those findings are what were released this hour. However, the district attorney back then refused to charge the parents, citing a lack of evidence. And then fast forward to 2006, JonBenet's mother, Patsy Ramsey, passed away after a long battle with ovarian cancer. Then in 2009, the Boulder, Colorado district attorney, a different one now, wrote an apology letter to John Ramsey, officially exonerating both parents in JonBenet's death. Well, joining us now, Ashley Merchant, a criminal defense attorney, and Dan Schorr, a former prosecutor. Thank you both for joining us. Let's get right to what the grand jury had to say. They recommended a charge against both parents of child abuse resulting in death, saying, quote, John Ramsey and separately Patricia did permit a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health. The jury also saying John Ramsey and separately Patricia did render assistance to a person with the intent to prevent the discovery, conviction, and punishment of the person for the commission of a crime, knowing the person being assisted had committed and was suspected of the crime of murder in the first degree and child abuse resulting in death. A lot of legal language there. But Dan, what do you make of that recommendation by the grand jury?
Well, the grand jury is concluding that the Ramsey parents killed their daughter and tried to cover it up. It's important to note that the grand jury burden of proof is just probable cause. That's much lower than the burden would be at trial beyond a reasonable doubt. It's very rare that you see a prosecutor receive an indictment from a grand jury and decide not to go forward with it. Usually prosecutors only go to a grand jury if they themselves believe there's evidence meriting a prosecution. So this is certainly an unusual case.
Ashley, as Dan is saying, the implication here is that the grand jurors believed possibly one of them killed her and the other one covered it up, but they weren't sure which was which. Is that your read on it?
I think it could have been that, but I also think it could have been that the son did it, because I know that there was a son in the home as well, or someone that the Ramseys knew and that they were covering it up. Because what the indictment says to me is that the Ramseys put their child in a position where she could be abused, and this could have happened, and then they helped cover it up, which means to me that they knew who did it, and they were helping conceal that and wouldn't come forward to the police with that evidence.
Yeah, you're referring to their son, Burke, who was also later exonerated by the subsequent DA, as we mentioned earlier. Some of what was known at the time, the Ramseys reported her missing the morning after Christmas, said later they found her wrapped in a blanket in the basement, duct tape on her mouth, a cord around her neck, evidence of sexual assault, no sign of forced entry. Also this odd ransom note signed a small foreign faction asking for $118,000, a strange amount. What facts do you feel compelled this grand jury to indict, Dan?
Well, the facts you mentioned are certainly important, but we don't really know from what's been released what led the grand jury to indict the parents. And in fact, John Ramsey himself, through an attorney, said that if they're going to release this indictment, they should release the transcripts of all the testimony from the grand jury, because then we can see what led to this conclusion and we could note any weaknesses in what the grand jury considered. They did not obviously consider the DNA evidence that came out around 2008 that seemed to exonerate the parents. So we don't know what evidence the grand jury used. The judge that released this grand jury indictment said that the actual transcripts are still protected under the secrecy laws, and that because they're not an actual finding, they can't be made public.
Yeah, Ashley, Dan making some great points there, that John Ramsey's lawyer fought against the release of just the 18 pages, saying it has to be all or nothing, because just the summary would be defamatory against him. And as Dan said, a lot of information has come out since then, DNA tests bolstering the theory that John Bonet was in fact killed by an intruder, and then a later DA, Mary Lacey, saying the Ramseys and their son are no longer under suspicion and should be treated as victims. Did John Ramsey have a point about not letting just this 18 pages come out?
I think that I would have liked to have seen the rest of the investigation, but I understand why we want to protect the grand jury, because those folks are doing a very important job, a very vital job, and what they consider is considered secret, and they don't want to be attacked later on. Even their identities are secret. I would like to see what they are, and I do think that he had a very good point. I would like to see everything put out in the open, but I understand why the judge does not want to do that.
Dan, what about Burke in all of this? That grand jury indictment only mentions the two parents there.
Right. So as far as we know, they just indicted the two parents. We don't know what evidence was presented to the grand jury. We don't know if they were given charges to consider against Burke and rejected them. If this case had gone on towards trial later on, the defense would have received a bill of particulars, which would outline the specifics of what they were accused of doing and what evidence there was. And of course, then there would have been a public trial. So as far as we know, there's no charges regarding him, but we don't know what the grand jury considered.
Yeah, Ashley, the last word here. What more do you expect to come of this now that this is out? Obviously, a brand new focus on this very old case.
Well, the grand jury could decide to break their secrecy, and some of those folks could come out and talk about what they considered if they wanted to. That would be their choice. They could come out and consider that. But I think at this point, it seems as though the case has gone cold, and until they take that DNA evidence that they did get from that little girl and compare it against other suspects, I think the case is going to remain cold. But I would love to see them run that against the database that is growing every day.
Right. Ashley Merchant, Dan Schorr, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.